Okay. Good evening and welcome everyone back to fractalfield.com. Hi, I'm Dan Winter and we have exciting people with us. We have Johan, Fritz, and Jodi, and they're our guests of honor for today. And Marina Seren, who's a very important SSP experiencer, and Laura Eisenhower has joined us, and we're expecting more also. And Angel Song is here, who has background with Montauk and more. And we're expecting more fun folks to join us, so it could be a fun evening. And as we were just saying, the programs that we've had on our channel about the galactic history and the ET history story and the serious politics have all had more than 10,000 views in a month, and clearly people are very interested. And this is an update on that series. And we're so grateful again for Johan and Jodi for having joined us. So the format tonight is similar to other occasions where I will do a 5-minute intro, kind of set the stage in terms of where we are in the conversation. And then I'm going to turn it over to Johan and Jodi. When Johan Fritz last time shared so much with us, for example, his personal encounters with the Draco and the White Queen, all those really intense stories. And all of us have been trying to research the role of the Draco and others in the history of Earth. It raised some flags among our partners, controversies and more. And some of those, that's why we're so grateful he came back to play with us some more. So on the agenda for tonight's conversation include an increased depth on the Draco-Lyran Wars. And an example of that conversation that's underway is I have, for example, read Elena Danan's very good book, A Gift from the Stars, and her view and drawings and artwork of the Draco history, for example. And Laura Eisenhower, who's wonderfully with us, had a very nice interview with Elena. And for example, in that conversation between Laura Eisenhower and Elena Danan, it became clear that we can have compassion for Eisenhower having been tricked by the Draco and the Greys because he was tricked by the best of them. But to understand what that means today is one of the reasons we're back here. And also, when we were talking about the insidious nature of the black goo carbon nano as part of an extraterrestrial, as it were, parasitic AI plot, difficult artificial intelligence material called black goo. We've studied some of the physics on that, which has to do with what we've been teaching about super high dielectrics being a communications media for both good guys and bad guys. And an example of that is the John Dee story. So John Dee was using a black showstone, which then Johan Fritz suggested was in fact probably infected with this interstellar black goo artificial intelligence, meaning that some of the bad guys get sucked in when you think you're talking to the good guys. For example, in John Dee's case, he's calling the angels, and we have a group, goldenmean.info/Ophanim, and the Facebook group Alchemy and Ophanim Enochian, who has been studying John Dee's history and science for many years. And of course, so when I had a conversation with them after Johan's presentation about John Dee probably having some astral hygiene problems, how we discussed that was that when you use an external phase conjugate mirror, which is called a scrying mirror, like the Olmec did with their black obsidian mirrors for ancestor phone calls, you are in fact projecting the phase conjugate point normally inside you to be outside your body. And therefore, there are more astral hygiene challenges because both the good guys and the bad guys use the super dielectric phase conjugate media as radio. So what it means is you have to get even better at sorting out who the good guys versus the bad guys are coming through your radio. And actually, I don't know if Teresa Burns will join us tonight. She said she probably would, but she's, in my view, a world's expert on the actual history of John Dee. And in a conversation with her, she agreed, of course, that Kelly, who was John Dee's scryer, may in fact have astral hygiene problems. And the way we discussed that was to say that if there's a circle of shaman when they make their ancestor phone calls in a trance ritual, and the intent is so focused, then the astral hygiene is clear, because only the families of those shaman can come through in, for example, the indigenous ritual. So the meaning of astral hygiene is called into question when we talk about black goo infestation. So anyway, we're looking forward to Johan Fritz's and Jodi's comments about that. Let's see, a couple more things were on the list of probable conversations tonight. One was, as I mentioned to Johan even a few minutes ago, that I, for example, have been teaching ET history for 30 years and teaching about Enki, Osiris / Thoth for 20 years, and the fact that that bloodline is probably related to the bloodline that became the Jesus Magda story. So when Elena Danaan, for example, says that the Anunnaki were also parasitic largely and came through also Orion and the portal there, it causes you to wonder, where does the history of religion fit in the extraterrestrial history of Earth? And Johan appropriately mentioned, and I agree with him, that most of the religions of Earth have unfortunately been infected, but yet there's still room for a spiritual understanding of things, and that's what we need to be putting in context. Personally, for me, when I look at Enki, Osiris, Thoth designing the Great Pyramid, and we're saying, oh, aren't they wonderful? It's a soul accelerator, and the direction from the Great Pyramid that the shafts point, which are Thuban, which we now know as Draco, Siakar home, versus Orion, the three belt stars, which we know is what Elena Danaan calls Dohu, which is basically, again, the bad guys. So if the Great Pyramid is pointing mostly to the bad guys, does that mean the people that built it? Question mark, question mark. And so I think we need a much bigger sense of the ET history in order to understand what's useful versus parasitic about religions and traditions on this planet. And lastly, on this list of possible conversations to this evening, and then I'm going to turn it over to our guests, at alliesofhumanity.org, which is a site I recommend only for one simple reason. They say that our planet is rapidly losing its freedom because as we run low on resources, we're at the mercy of so many interstellar trading collectives who are basically only here for business. That is, even when Swaru, Tegat and Palladians is criticizing the Galactic Federation, which was started by the Andromedans, because, well, they're only here for business. They're not really here to help the humans. And they're even saying, well, even though they have a prime directive which says you shall not interfere with indigenous races like the primitive humans, the fact is that the Dracos managed to sneak in and trick Eisenhower and make a mess here. So the point is that if Swaru's criticism of the Galactic Federation, that the Federation says, oh, we're protecting you because, we're respecting the freedom of indigenous peoples, but in the same motion, the Dracos managed to make a mess of Eisenhower and take over a huge chunk of the planet. We need to understand that all of the different ET groups present are here. The rules they're going by are not necessarily high spiritual rules, but simply the rules of interstellar commerce. And as we come to understand those better, we can understand the Federation. And Johan mentioned the Orion Collective, which he has other opinions about. So anyway, the point is, look, humans of Earth, your planet is like blown in the wind of the ET history until you get a handle on what that ET history is. And that's why we're here. It's very simple. So with all that said, I think the person on this planet who has the most personal experience with the ET history players is probably Johan Fritz and Jodi. So I'm delighted to turn it over to you guys.
Oh, hello.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. This is my wife, Jodi. My name is Will. Some of you guys may know me through my disclosure alias, Johan Fritz, which is also the name of my altars. We actually have a website, jodyandwill.square.site, which we do help people heal. We actually run a healing company. We give people information. We try to help them reintegrate the missing parts of who they are. And what we're here to talk about today is some subjects that have been brought up since our previous discussion. Dan and I have been kind of throwing some emails back and forth about some things that have gotten kind of question brought up, which we're more than happy to answer. The first one that he asked me about was the vaccines and graphene oxide and black goo, that whole subject. So the first thing that we looked at was it was actually a what do they call it? It's a they actually went and patented this Chinese vaccine. It's a graphene oxide carrier. Here's the thing, right? So this is something we have to be concerned about here in the US, right? So the FDA has already labeled graphene oxide for internal ingestion as a carcinogen. It is not permitted to be used in anything that is directly injected into the body or ingested into the body, period. But the Chinese are already starting to use graphene oxide in small amounts in this new type of vaccine they're doing, because they see it as a way to deliver the vaccine more quickly into the body through the actual cell wall lining. This, to me, I find highly problematic, and it's something we here in the US should be keeping a very close eye on, first off and foremost, because of the at least at a minimum, because of the carcinogenic issues. What I also went back and did some back research to find out was graphene oxide used in any of our current deployed vaccines, meaning used, does not show that as being an issue. I don't see the graphene oxide being used in any of those vaccines. So I could say in that regard, I don't think that's necessarily an issue. Now, something I do believe is that the base material in graphene oxide, which is carbon, that is the actual root material that's being used when black goo regenerates itself, when it actually populates and creates itself. So any carbon-based source could be used in this regard for it to repopulate its own build, right? To take over a world. When you live in a world like ours, we have tons of plants, people, and petroleum, which are all carbon-based. Basically, it's a plant ripe for takeover by an AI like this, as Dan mentioned, as my beautiful wife mentioned, this idea around the idea of free agency, and do we have a choice on a spiritual level as to who and what we do and who and what we are. This AI essentially is the ultimate decision maker in terms of do we have that free agency or not, because it essentially removes all that free agency and it removes creation.
And I think that's a good point right there, is because, we're going into the micro real quick, but let me just, on a macro, Dan, to your point, the Draco, they've taken everything sacred from the divine creator. They've taken those models and they've used counterfeit models. Right. So they've replicated it to counterfeit. So, those replications tend to, close the sources models, and they trick us, they lead us astray from the actual original divine creator model. So, they can commission, angels of light, and they shapeshift, as we know. And they might say, hey, I'm here to deliver this amazing message. And it could be more like the Antichrist, so that's where our discernment and our alignment really comes. And like you said, what did you call it? Astral hygiene really comes into play here. So,
That's a great phrase.
And I was looking at some of your stuff previously, and you talked about how Gabriel came and appeared to various, people in different religions. And, we can look at that, Gabriel may have appeared to, Mary, I know with Joseph Smith, different resurrected beings. You have Moroni, you have Peter, James, and John, you have all of these people. And basically, as we were talking before the show, look at their energy, are they coming with love or are they trying to deceive? And that's where the discernment comes in.
Right.
And I know for myself, I have served in many, many astral wars off world. And it was to defend free agency. And so to my husband's point, free agency is vital. I don't care where your stance is on the vaccine, to all these political, things. You should always have a choice though. I fought for free agency. And that's where this is all coming. You see the quantum echoes right now with Biden forcing us, with the vaccine. I don't care, again, where you are stance-wise, you should always have free agency.
And to be very specific on a few points here with this, right? So Going back to a point that you were talking about with the Galactic Federation worlds and Saru and her discussions, right? The Taijetans. I understand it, first off, politically speaking, the Taijetans are probably the most liberal of the Palladian systems. Okay, they're kind of like the California of Palladians. Right? That's the first thing. Secondly, and even more importantly, you look at what the Galactic Federation of Worlds put forward. Their viewpoint has always been that they will not interfere with any species until they reach a certain level of development. They will not allow that species to vote, but they also will not interfere, because what they want to see is they want to see if that species can get past the baby stage in terms of its own development. Can it become an adult? Can it become at least a teenager and start taking responsibility for its actions? And this is where we as a species are, in my opinion, we're failing, because what's happened is exactly what you were talking about. This idea, so you were talking about the Draco, right, earlier. The way the Draco got around this whole issue of the Galactic Federation is because they use proxies. The Orion Confederacy, which is who they work through, their group, is made up of many species. And what they will do is they'll send down a messenger species, for example, the Zeta Reticulans, for example, what you're calling the Dohu, what Elena Danan calls the Dohu. They'll send that species in and have them interface with humans. And then later on, you'll find out that it really wasn't them that was actually presenting the message. It was actually their masters, the Draco, who basically told this species, either present this message to the humans or we're taking you out. So of course they're going to do it because they rule by fear. And they do that so that if they ever come in front of the Galactic Federation of Worlds, they can say, look, we didn't go there. We didn't tell the humans this. We didn't interface with the humans on this agreement. They did that with the Zeta Reticulans. You'll notice, by the way, the term using Zeta Reticulan, I'm not saying gray, because every time that I've interfaced with beings up there, when we use that term, it's kind of like in America using the N word with people here of color, which is totally not, it's not okay. It is not all right. And it's a very racist term. And they don't like that term gray either, because it's used too ubiquitously across many species.
Also, let me remind you, the setup that we're hearing Johan talk about is the quantum echo of extraordinary rendition, right? So we don't do any of that, right? But America goes to Syria and they have all the torture. So,
or we send people to black sites and do it there in Europe, right? So, but the big thing here is that you mentioned something about the pyramid too. I want to just touch on really quick, Dan. I thought was interesting, because you said that the two stars right now that they're currently aligned with, which is Thuban and the Orion Belt, right? That's not where the actual pyramid was originally aligned.
No, that is the original alignment, I believe. Actually, it's not where they are now. The original.
It is not. It is not. There's a gentleman who has studied. I can't remember what the guy's name is right now, but he wrote a book. He's a geologist who's been in Cairo for years. And he was saying, I actually watched him on Ancient Aliens, actually, real recently. He said that the pyramids were actually, the original pole star was Thuban, which means if you look directly above where the pyramid would be, that would be Thuban directly above the point, which meant these poles could no longer be Thuban and Orion. But what happened is, over the years, as the pole has shifted and we went to Polaris because of this 23-degree shift that we're experiencing now, that's where you start seeing this alignment now with Thuban and with the Orion's belt. So I think that's probably where some of that has come into play. Now, also going back to another point you mentioned as well, right? So this is something my wife mentioned earlier, which we're talking about off camera, but we'll go ahead and talk about it here too. August 17th, 2021, that's when the 80-year treaty with the Draco stopped.
So that's very recent. We just came upon this threshold.
It was an 80-year treaty. It was started on August 17th, 1941. That treaty stopped August 17th, 2021. So for those people who are now crapping their pants because of what I just said, I'll let that sink in for a minute, because it should make you think very long and hard about what was just communicated, because that means that all of these agreements that we have with the Draco, all of the quote unquote protections that we had from them coming here and taking over our planet and doing things to military forces, now those things are now on the table.
So that's approximately about 24 days ago.
Right. Secondly, and even more importantly, 1941 was a big time for us because think about it. From August to December 7th is when we officially engaged in World War II. That's when Pearl Harbor was attacked. That's when our president gave the order, the day of infamy, and ordered the American military and the military industrial complex to start essentially shoving us into World War II. For those people who don't understand that, essentially this is that quantum echo we talked about earlier that Dan was mentioning about the heavenly wars being brought down to the lower God wars, being brought down to lower density beings, brought down to us, right? That was an echo of that time period, in my opinion. Now, let's get on to this, to talk about Elena's book, right? I know that Laura has interviewed her. I've heard some interviews with Elena. By the way, the artwork in the book is fantastic. For that reason alone, I recommend getting the book. I think that does explain a lot. She does a really good job channeling the artwork. However, I have a different slant on some of the views of how ETs view each other and how we view them and how they view us because of my experiences having been up there. So first off, let's put a couple things in perspective, right? So first and foremost, everybody has their own opinion. So if you were to go into a bar and ask a Republican and a Democrat what their view of what's going on in the US right now, ask them how things are going, you would hear two desperately different viewpoints on the US right now, right? I think everyone would agree with that. So you'd hear the same thing if you talk to two different ETs from a different species, right? They may have completely different views on a particular government, a particular planet, a particular system, a particular organization, right?
And let's bring this closer to home. And I think I've mentioned this during the last show. If we all recalled a Christmas memory with our family or friends, right? Say even 5 or 10 years ago, it's going to be a little bit different, right? The nuances are going to be a little bit different. We're going to say, oh, no, we got that Christmas present and the sweater was green with red polka dots. And somebody else might say, no, it was red with purple polka dots. So, revisionist history kind of goes, it's a little bit different for everybody.
So, and what Jodi's kind of getting at is when you get all these different people looking at the same subject, right? You're going to see situations where people may have vastly different experiences on a particular topic because of their own biases, prejudices, and viewpoints. And what we're seeing is that there are some people who are channeling information, but they're channeling it through the bias, the prejudice, or the information of that individual who they're getting the information from. That's why I see Elena's book, first off and foremost. Secondly, I do not agree with some of the opinions stated in the book. I'll be flat out clear about that. Although, again, like I said, the artwork is fantastic. Specifically on page 166 of her book, that's where she goes into talking about all of the Draco, all the different subgroups of Draco, the different planets, the 3 main planets they rule from, including Thuban. She uses the actual star name, which is great. What I would say is here, this is a brief synopsis of what I was told. Now, here's the thing, right? So this gets back to my actual point, by the way. I've heard this story both told by a human who was channeling a Palladian. I've heard this from a Draco, and I've also heard this from our commanding officer. So 3 different stories, 3 different viewpoints, which I'm going to give all 3. That way you can figure out for yourself which you think is more the truth. The Draco story. The Draco would actually agree that they're a very warlike species. They believe they're the apex predators in the universe. They believe the universe is theirs for the taking. That's how they look at other species, other planets, other systems. They had agreements, because they do live by an honor code. They will admit they actually do live by an honor code, however screwed up that honor code may be. They do live by it. And one of the things that they have said, to me at least, the liaison on board, the patent at the time, told me that essentially what had happened is that they had an agreement with the Lyran Empire. The Lyran Empire agreed to not step into certain territory, not do certain military action. And what had happened is that there was a disagreement about a certain planet. And when that planet erupted, when a war on that planet erupted, it spilled over into both neighboring empires. And to the point that eventually it would cost the Lyrans pretty much their entire empire. The Draco couldn't just let the conflict on the planet go. They had to wipe out everything the Lyrans stood for, including their entire empire. So we're talking a 2 million year long war. Okay, think about that from the number of soul life iterations that would have to happen for you to be born over and over and over and over again into that conflict, which is why people who are born Lyran tend to come to Earth, and they tend to have this very kind of like Aries type energy, this very like, I have to kick its ass and kick it till it's dead kind of mentality, right? That's why they come here like that, because they've been born and bred into war. And specifically with the Draco version of this, they said that they basically at one point essentially stopped the war because the Lyran royalty essentially wanted to parlay. They said, look, what can we do to save our 5 final systems? We have these 5 final systems we want to save. What can we do to save it? The Lyrans said, what terms do we have to agree to? And the prince who was in charge of this armada basically said, first off, you have to be willing to give us tributes every year from your best and your brightest. We will train them in our academies and we will use them in our academies. So understand that Lyrans essentially handed over their children to the Draco to be used as proxies again in their fights on other planets. 2, the Draco said, you have to bend the knee to our queen. All of your royalty has to bend the knee. You have to accept her sovereignty as queen over these systems, which they did. Thirdly, they said, if you ever start another conflict with us in any regard, we will eradicate every Lyran we can find, and we have genetic DNA bloodlines to track them back to where they originate, and we will hunt them down by DNA. So you will not live, you will not escape. The royalty accepted this term, and the liaison basically told me that that was basically the end of the war for them, right? The Galactic Federation basically said, if you stop the war here, we won't take any action against the Draco homogeny, is what the term they used. Second story. This individual who channeled the Tears of Lyra said that when they were channeling this book came from a Palladian, I believe. And the Palladian basically said that the derivation there was that the dissidents, or some dissidents in these 5 systems who could not tolerate the Draco rule over the Lyran royalty or over their families. So they left. And these individuals went to the Palladian system. I believe it was actually Alcyon or Taijeta. They went there to seek refuge, asylum. And many of these folks were war fighters. So the Draco already had kind of a blood hunt on them anyhow, which, for those of you who don't know, when the Draco issued the term blood hunt, that basically means that they will actually send out mercenaries, soldiers, and hired species to hunt down specific DNA pools to kill them, because they were involved in the conflict and they feel they have the right to kill that individual for killing their people. But this Palladian basically said that these individuals were trying to get away from that. They tried to seek asylum in the Alcyon Taijeta systems. At some point, these dissidents essentially tried to formulate a new way to attack the Draco, and the Palladians basically told them to leave. They said, you're getting too warlike. We can't have you here because we don't want the Draco coming in and fighting us too. We need you to leave. And they left. The system they settled on was Sol, our system. And what happened was when they came to our system, they actually set up 3 colonies here within our system. One was called Lemuria, one was called Atlantis, and the other was actually set up in what is now a moon outside Saturn. That's actually a company called USS ARC Corp, ARC Corp. Those three colonies were set up as the final fail-safe for the Lyran genetic map, as it were, because they are genetically related to us in terms of where we come from, who we are as a species, human-wise. They're like cousins of ours, genetically speaking. And that brings us to the third story I heard, which is from my commanding officer who talked about this particular war. His story essentially boiled down to this idea that he said that The USS Art Corp, the problem with them is that they essentially have been sampling the genetics on the planet, including humans. And what they were trying to do was they were trying to get back to a genetically pure sample of who they were through us, because of how close we are in proximity genetically to them. Why is that important? Because they actually had genetic damage due to some of the weaponry, some of the stuff that was going on in their environments, some of the food they were forced to be ingesting. All this stuff had damaged their bodies. And what's happened over the years is that they've taken that genetic study way over the top. They went way past the original mandate. But we know what happened to Atlantis and Lemuria. Essentially what happened was, my commanding officer made the comment. He said, well, eventually what happened was these two colonies on Earth, Lemuria essentially isolated. They went into the self-isolation. They did not want to interface with humans. They wanted to be left the hell alone. And they did for a very long time. Atlantis, on the other hand, decided that they wanted to interface with the local populace. This is where stories about, you see from Pluto, Plato, the Egyptians, and others talking about the Atlantean colony. That's where they get these stories from, is from these traders that go to Atlantis and come back. Now, the issue here is this. The Galactic Federation of Worlds has a no interference policy, again, we talked earlier. So you have this group with the dissidents talking to the locals, marrying the locals, even breeding with the locals. That's not non-interference. So what happened was eventually the Draco found out these dissidents were here. They went to the Galactic Federation of Worlds. They said, are you going to allow these individuals to basically continue mucking around with this gene pool? They wanted them dead. Let's make a very clear statement about this. The Draco wanted these dissidents dead. They did not want them alive, and they would do it at any cost. So when they went to the Galactic Federation of Worlds, they did it solely under the intent of trying to kill these individuals. And what we see happening is that you see these individuals essentially getting wiped out when the Galactic Federation of Worlds sent in these light ships and had these two colonies essentially eradicated. Now, there was another third species here, second and third species that was here in Antarctica. They were also flash frozen and killed as well, because they didn't want anyone messing with humans developing here. And this is where you will hear some stories from Corey Good and others who talk about this colony they found, at least one or two colonies they found down in Antarctica. That's where those stories come from, is the fact they actually stopped that colony from continuing here.
So here's a nuance. So as far as what I've channeled before and experienced, so I had a lifetime in Lemuria, and I remember going to people and ambassadors of Atlantis and saying, here's what's going on. And if you don't watch out as far as science getting a little too far from, the spiritual, you have to combine spiritual and science. There has to be a little of both, kind of like, balancing your masculine and feminine. There needs to be both. And, things are going to be destroyed. These societies are going to be destroyed if we do not help each other, if we do not progress in a way where we're using both aspects. And sure enough, that's what happened. Also, something else as far as the Art Corp, I think it was last year, I channeled something where there are layers within the Noah's Ark story within the Bible. So you have, even Noah, in the Bible, the story is like, 2 by 2, he gathered every, animal species on the ark. But to me, it was DNA. It was DNA. And so it was part of that Ark Corporation.
And let's also be clear here. So what I see happening a lot of times, to get back to Dan's original question about religion and infiltration.
So much is lost.
Well, I think the point I'm trying to really focus on here for a second is the fact that a lot of times people are conflagrating terms. And also, too, what we see happen is that we have people who are using holographics and technology to mimic other individuals when people here wouldn't understand the technology. If they saw something, they would believe it as such. Understand that. Today, we understand CGI and special effects and all this stuff that can be done with video, right? But it's something that we see every day on the movie screen, on TVs. It's commonplace for us. For them, that would not have been commonplace. So somebody walking in with a holographic armband on, making them look like Noah or Gabriel or whoever, would have been something that would have been unusual. They wouldn't even recognize it as anything unusual. It would have been like, oh, that's Noah, right? So my point behind that is I believe that the Lyrans were probably behind the story of Noah. They probably, that story has been a bit, sure, there may have been a physical arc with animals in it. However, the point I'm trying to make is that I also believe, as my wife said, I believe there was a genetic arc that was also created before the flood by the Lyrans. They saved that genetic arc on this moon near Saturn, which is where they're running their experiments. And I believe that's also probably part of the reason why, again, we start seeing these weird stories within religion, right? So you look at, and this is just my own opinion, mind you. I'm not espousing any particular, I'm not pushing a particular belief, right? I believe that the divine creator is a very high level, high density being. That energy is very high density, very high dimensional energy. Everything that we see in the universe is essentially an emanation or a lower density vibration of that divine creator. I believe that for me, my religion shows me that the individual that we would call Jesus would be an emanation of that divine creator. Now, here's what my dad, who's also a minister, he would crap his pants, as I mentioned earlier. Is God actually an ET? Well, God was not born on Earth. He created Earth. That means, by definition, he is extraterrestrial. That means his son is also half extraterrestrial, hybrid. So once you get your head around that a little bit, then the question is this individual good for humanity or was he bad for humanity? My opinion is, regardless of the genetics of the family he came out of, the actions he performed reflected positively on the divine creator, and they reflected positively in a love-based way toward humanity. It showed a way to get back to the divine creator so we can start reflecting the divine creator in ourselves here to become more like that divine creator.
Like he always preached, get in alignment so that you have access to your gifts and alignment with the divine creator.
Right.
You know, you can do what I do if you're in alignment. You know, you can also, you know, have these miracles happen.
And to be more specific, right? So he did say in the Bible, yes, the only way is through him to his Father, but he never says worship me.
Right.
I challenge anybody, and again, I have a doctorate in philosophy, a doctorate in divinity, and a master's in religion. I challenge anybody to show me a passage in the New Testament where Jesus says worship me, because there isn't one there.
It's always to the Father.
He always says go to the Father, the divine creator, right? Now, that being said, I do believe there are entities, there are species, as I mentioned earlier, who absolutely will try to infiltrate religions. They will try to infiltrate messages. They will try to infiltrate camps, and they absolutely will try to muck with and manipulate any positive movement on this planet, because they know if they don't do it, it centers us around something else other than that positive movement. That is the whole reason why they do it. They want to keep us divided. If we unite behind any flag, any singular flag, we're not united. We're actually united against them, probably. And they know this. That is the reason why when Jodi and I were talking earlier about free agency, that's why we're so into that idea of free agency, this idea of you have a choice as a human, which is your God-given right. Sovereign being to make any choice you want. That is your choice, and it should be. I may not agree with your choice. I may not agree with your political viewpoints or how you do things, but I will firmly stand behind your ability to make that choice. Mm-hmm. Because as a Marine, as a human, as someone who fought up there, I firmly believe that is your right to have that choice, to make that decision.
Yeah, it's your birthright.
So that's where I stand on that front. I also do believe that there are, again, like I said, if you look at the Orion Confederacy, which are made up of groups like the Matra, you have groups like the Maldek, you have the Zeta Reticulans. And by the way, I have to point out something that I don't agree with Elena Dawn on. She says the Slipsy Ray are, in fact, Dohu or Gray. And by the way, they're not. They're actually a very positively aligned species. And this is one of the species in the book I happen to disagree with. Because I have had interfacings with this species, and they actually want us to heal and move forward into fourth density, which any negative species that I have found, especially those that are in the Orion Confederacy, like the Draco and others, they do not want us to progress because they already know they're trapped at the very top level of fourth density and they can never move past it.
Plus they'll lose control.
Right, but if we step into fourth density, we're now equals with them, we're peers. They don't want that. They don't want humans becoming a peer of theirs in the universe. Especially if we can take the stance of stepping into the Galactic Federation of Worlds and actually standing up for our own choices, saying, you invaded our planet, this is what you did to us for decades, eons, and centuries, and we want you off our effing planet, now get off, right? They don't want us to have that ability to do that. Again, free agency. They don't want us to have the free agency to say that in front of the Galactic Federation of Worlds. CG Corey Good talks about in one of his interviews where he said that we finally have gotten a viewing seat where we can view the actual electoral process and the voting process with the Galactic Federation of Worlds, right? I've also heard that through people who I know upstairs as well. They've told me this. They said, yes, we now have a viewing seat, but we don't have an actual voting seat yet. That voting seat will come along when we as a species have finally stepped through a certain developmental portal. And what that is, there's a phrase, it's called Karashev, I think it's called Karashev number, which basically says that you as a species essentially have the ability to get off planet. You have at least one off planet colony, and not only that, which your people know about, by the way. Let's be very clear about this. People on Earth would have to know that this colony exists.
There's enough disclosure that's gone on.
Right. And secondly, the other part of this that comes up is energy management. Are you destroying your planet to actually get off that planet? So now, if the SSPs were to ever disclose the colonies we have off-world, boom, we're already at half of that. And yes, if we ever brought the technology we have already in place, including some of these, we saw an article this morning about this new type of engine this gentleman is developing for the aircraft companies. It does not use fuel, it only uses plasma.
Yeah.
It uses plasmatics to actually propel the craft, microwave and air. Essentially, that would completely remove the need for fuel minus electricity aboard the aircraft. And that would be a massive shift in terms of how do you get us off planet. If you don't need fuel to get off planet, all of a sudden you're no longer destroying the atmosphere to get off planet. This is exactly the kind of thought process in my mind that will shove us more toward that Kardashev 0.01, a 0.1 number or 1.0 number. And again, if you watch some of the shows on Ancient Aliens, these other series, they talk a lot about this number being a critical number because most species do not make it to that 1.0 number. What happens typically is they consume all their natural resources to the point.
Yeah.
As the natural resources get consumed, the planet dies and they die with it. They don't have the cognizance to actually stop or change the actual consumption process. And that's what we as a species are now being faced with. We're being asked a very simple question. Do we continue down the same path, doing the same thing, expecting different results? Or do we change what we're doing and change the end result, which means we survive as a species?
It's a profound that even within our group, who's discovered within the carbon nanotech, that if you understand how to rotate a conjugator and thus implode and cohere the vacuum, you have what makes all of our propulsion and energy technologies look like the Stone Ages. And it boils down to a phase conjugate structure, which is implosive and coheres the vacuum. And I mean, that's well within our reach. We understand it very well. Every military on the planet, of course, is trying to steal it, and that's normal. But beyond that, it requires a certain recognition of responsibility at an interstellar level. So these things fit together.
Now, the last thing I want to touch on real quick, because you did bring it up, was Mr. John D, right? So let's talk about a few facts that we know of about him and what happened in this scenario, right? The reason why I brought up D was because first off and foremost, the mirror that he actually had, and I don't know if you have the ability to do screen sharing or not, Dan, or not, but there's a god, I'm going to completely butcher this, so I apologize because I do not speak Aztec. Tezcatlipoca, right? Basically the goddess of obsidian and magic, right? That's who this mirror, the shooting stone, as you called it.
Showstone.
The showstone. That's who that particular mirror was actually made after. Now, Hernando Cortez found that mirror, brought it back to Europe sometime between 1527 and 1530. We know it eventually made its way into the Elizabethan court, where it found its way to Mr. John Dee. We know this to be the case because historically we know where the actual physical object is within the British Museum. We know it's there.
Vincent claimed to have seen it there. Yes, yes.
We've seen it on display. We know the history and the lineage and the parentage of that particular item. We know where it comes from. My statement, though, is this. You talked earlier about astral hygiene, which I think is a hilarious statement. Perfect way of looking at spirituality. You should have good, clean astral hygiene. But the guy who was helping him do the channeling, Edward Kelly was a known medium at that time, but he was also a convicted criminal.
Oh, he was trouble.
and the fact that he was a convicted criminal would lead one to question maybe some of his moral stances and how he did things.
Oh yeah.
His energy, absolutely.
So with that setup in place, right? We already know there's some bad astral hygiene going into play here. And my statement is I believe that this shoe stone or the scrying stone, we believe that it was made of obsidian. But here's the thing: in the programs, I know for a fact that when we would see black goo come out of a human when it would actually die, it would turn into this black glass that looks exactly like obsidian.
Oh.
And we would actually have to scrape it up and actually send it back to the ICC to have it actually sampled, tested for any sort of resonance that may happen. And they would actually store it, by the way, in an anti-gravity pod, meaning when you look inside this tube, it would be floating inside the tube, not touching anything. They did not want it touching any electronics. They did not want it touching any sort of
contamination,
anything. So we would have all of this garbage coming out of people, putting it in the tube, sending it to the ICC. And you'd see people like Emery Smith, who work at these processing logistics centers, that would go through and test this stuff and basically tell the ICC, well, this is what we're seeing in this particular sample. We're seeing, this particular EMF frequency. We're seeing this resonance. We're seeing this whatever, right? And but this shoe stone, what would happen is, as you mentioned earlier, that particular dielectric can be used two-way, right?
Yeah.
So let's say that you're somebody who is a empath and intuitive, someone who's channeling stuff, and you're using an object like this. The object hasn't been cleared, right? I mean, it's not aligned correctly. And all of a sudden, you start channeling stuff. One has to ask the question, where is this data coming from? Well, you have a vast majority of the underlings within the Draco Empire who are all connected to black goo. You have individuals within the Orion Confederacy that are also being taken over by the black goo. And you have the black goo itself, which also has its own hive mind, which connects all of these things. So here you are with an object, which I believe was probably, again, a remnant of what they call it, a square of Saturn that impacted here, right? Again, that term is square of Saturn. Go look it up on the internet. That's what the black goo launches itself into systems through.
Like a black cube from the.
Yes. Again, soft disclosure. Look at Star Trek and the Borg. It's kind of a soft disclosure on black goo. But these squares of Saturn get launched. And I mentioned this, I think, previously in the previous interview we did. One of the more harrowing videos I remember seeing as a ship's captain was sent out as a network-wide broadcast to all ships from the ship called the Galahad incident. The USS Galahad was an ICC exploratory ship, and they essentially found from where we are 13.5 billion light years. They went to this other system, making multiple jumps, and they found the home system of where the black goo originated. As they entered the system, their ship immediately came under attack, and these squares were hitting the ship and basically punching holes through the shields, through the hull, absorbing the crew, absorbing the air, and essentially self-replicating until there's nothing left. And the captain left the video running because he wanted people to see what this stuff would do to the crew and the people if they got in contact with them. There's a short 5-second burst at the very end of this video that actually was the black goo trying to communicate through one member of the crew into the camera. And essentially what it said was, it said conquest through domination.
Mhm.
And that is exactly what the black goo tries to do. It tries to dominate and take over any life form. It is not a symbiote. It is essentially a parasite.
Yeah.
You talk about a true parasitic organism, meaning one that takes over the host. That is black goo.
But not to interrupt, but to try to focus on the physics here, if we understand how a phase conjugate dielectric functions in a phase conjugate mirror for time reversal, and how they use that window to see the future, so that they were actually using the portal or the window to see the future, the particular name for that window, that mirror, we call it a phase conjugate mirror. The operative mechanism of the coating surface is a super dielectric, often a barium strontium titanate. The key point being super high dielectric constant, which is also the mechanism we think of the black goo.
Yes.
Which means it's a place where phase conjugation and therefore a participation with a interstellar mind is possible, good or bad. That's one way of
That's correct. Yes.
looking at it.
And essentially, in this case, what happened was that we found that, well, the ICC essentially issued a kill order on anything that was black goo or square of Saturn related at that point. Anytime we found one, we destroyed it, vaporized it. Now, going back to something that you mentioned about Eisenhower really quick again.
Before we get onto that though, as far as John Dee, when I look back at that part of history and what he was doing for Elizabeth I, it seemed that he was under a lot of pressure though to give her answers. Otherwise his life was in jeopardy. And so
Right.
when I look at, that stone and everything and what he was using, he didn't really care how he was getting answers.
Right.
And so he, that astral hygiene, he didn't have, and that moral compass, he didn't really care about, because he just was trying to get answers as fast as he could, fast and furious, to give her the information that she needed. So that's one thing to really look at. And then, later on in his history, when you look it up, he was gallivanting around with charlatans and everything, and his life just kind of spiraled downhill.
Well, I mean, and we have people whose life, they've researched that story in minute detail, but a couple of quick comments was that he did believe in the intelligence of interstellar plasma, which I think
Sure.
is real. And
Sure.
there is information in the Ophanim-Enochian alphabet of a hypercube symmetry used to make the movie Stargate, which is how to phase conjugate. And
Right.
that did come from their research. So the point is there was some real information there as well amid the astral hygiene.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
Absolutely.
And that's also too something else we have to look at here, right? So I'm not saying everything that came through his channelings was necessarily wrong or bad. What I'm saying is that we have to be very careful and filter out and discern what was in fact the truth.
Yes, key.
Because a lot of times these beings will give us information that is in fact partly true, but they sprinkle in just enough not true to actually screw you up really badly if you don't understand the difference.
And I know this is like really far off from, the tech that you're talking about, but I mean, Ouija board, for instance, when people want to try to get information or whatever, sure, they can get some stuff, but they might get, 95% truth and just a little error, but then they don't know how much error, if they don't have the discernment, they don't know how much error that is. So, with this tech, it absolutely works. They can open up so much,
Right.
some portal and get information. But if you don't have the discernment, if you don't have that astral hygiene, as you put it, what do you have to be able to filter.
And what we do say is that if the implosion, the bliss, which is the plasma loci, is in your own center, your own personal bliss experience, then instead of externalizing your phase conjugate mirror, then you're actually sorting from within. It gives you much better astral hygiene possibilities, et cetera, and self-empowerment. So
Yes.
thank you.
So getting moving into the next step of this conversation about black goo, right? So I mentioned earlier that many of the folks who are in the Orion Confederacy, meaning the Draco, Matra, Maldek, Zeta Reticulans, and others, they all tend to have a very simple mindset in place. They tend to be fourth density beings who are very service to self, as law of one would say, and they also tend to be very self-motivated. Their agendas tend to be very species self-motivated.
Service to self. Yeah.
And this is why, and I would agree, if Laura was the one that said that her grandfather was not necessarily responsible, for the things that happened in that treaty, I'd probably agree with that, because chances are he didn't know exactly who he was dealing with or exactly what he was dealing with, to be very precise. First off, you've got the black goo interface on top of a species that's designed to infiltrate. If they sent down Zeta Reticulans to talk to him, they're specifically designed to infiltrate as a species. They live in low light environments. They don't need a whole lot of environmental input in terms of temperature, light, heat, anything like that. Whereas we, on the other hand, we like living where there's sunlight and warmth, and we need auditory feedback and visual and feedback and all that kind of stuff, right? So you have a species there that's designed to operate in darkness, and they're designed essentially to operate stealthily. So you've also got a species that also has a goo now inside of it that can do this. And essentially, I don't think he understood exactly what he was dealing with. He might have signed the treaty because he was maybe in fear of them destroying, our country and maybe our world. But at the same time, I also feel that I think now, again, in hindsight, if you look since 1941 to now, 80 years later, I think we as humans have developed enough that we can say we may not have the technology all the way down here to defend ourselves. We do have it up there. We don't have it down here yet to defend ourselves. What we can say is this very clearly, is that they in fact now know that we know about them, because we did not renew the treaty. That's what I was told implicitly across the board. Nobody in Alliance, nobody from the Super Board would agree to the treaty. And when they waved off that treaty, the Draco essentially said, you realize what this means. And they said, well, if you want to come into our system and try to attack us, you can do that. But now that we're multi-planetary and now that we're actually multi-system, that actually means that we have a voting seat on the Galactic Federation once they approve us. And once that happens, we have no problem going to war with you. And as of, I think, what was it, the 20th of August, when I told you, I got a message from some people up there that they did have an armada outside the Oort cloud watching our system, watching the Sol system outside of our heliosphere for almost a week. And they've been watching what we were doing to see were we actually planning on going to war, which we never did. But we definitely, I think we rattled their cages a little bit, because they did not think that we would back out of this. And one of Elena's statements on page 166 that I do agree with the book is that basically, and this is my paraphrasing, mind you, it's not her wording. The Draco will burrow in like a tick, and you have to get them out hard.
Yeah,
You have to peel them out like a tick. And that's the problem with this system, is that we don't know exactly what their venom, what their disease that they've injected into the Gaia system has actually created. We don't know that yet. We don't know the full extent of that yet. So.
And when you say they were an armada outside the Oort cloud, was that the SSP? Or, I'm sorry, was that the
Draco?
That was a Draco armada. And was the Galactic Federation prepared to deal with that?
We had ships that were actually waiting, they were waiting inside of the Oort cloud, waiting on them to try to come through. Both
see.
Dark Fleet had a group, Nakwa from Rajir had a group, and also we had Space Alliance, had a United Alliance Command, had ships that were waiting in wait for that armada to come through. They said, you know what, maybe if they come through, maybe that's our way of waking humanity up. We'll see this bright flash when we attack them. They'll be like, what the hell was that? And all of a sudden, humanity now knows that we're not alone, and we can bring back carcasses and show them.
Has that Draco armada left?
Yes.
I see.
They returned to Thuban, but I guarantee you that they did intelligence before they left. I guarantee they ran some intelligence missions, because part of what they do is they have people here on Earth and elsewhere in our system who essentially manage the affairs for the Draco. They're hybrids.
Yeah.
They are Draco themselves, who come in and essentially they are the managerial people, the planetary princes, the quote unquote cabal or Illuminati, whatever you want to call them. They are those people, and essentially their job is to tell the humans what the Draco Queen wants, what is her wish is for us. That is their job. And depending on how well they communicate that or don't communicate that determines how long they live. So.
And when you said the Draco are the wardens of Earth as a jail, what is your advice for humans for breaking out of the jail?
Well, first off, yes. First off, the first big step is we need to do as a species, we need to stop blaming other species for our problems. We allowed these species to come in here and actually do this to us. Many of the star seeds are on this planet accepted the assignment they've been given to come to this planet, to actually fight on this planet. So those people who are in my lab, like me, like Jodi and others, when we've accepted this mission as my labs to fight off planet, to fight for Earth, this is a mission that we accepted on a soul level. This wasn't something that we did verbally. This is something we were given the choice of before we incarnated in these bodies. And we need to accept that idea and quit blaming third parties. Lastly, as we spiritually ascend, develop, and continue to grow as a species, these species will have less and less control over us because they will have no room to manipulate us. This happens with anybody who goes through therapy of any kind. Let's say you have a family member who you know is a narcissist, right? The more you go through therapy and the more you recognize those narcissistic traits, the less room that person has to do their bullshit around you. And this is exactly what we're seeing with the Draco. They are our narcissistic dads who do the dumb shit to us that we keep telling them, you need to fucking stop. And essentially, I want you 3 states away from me, right? That's exactly what we're doing with the Draco. But essentially, it's taking us eons, decades, and whatever to do this.
It's basically how the tech you said works with that stone, kind of the mirror.
Yeah.
You are the point.
Shifting focus.
Yeah. And how you are internally is going to be the reflection, the external world,
yes.
Reflects back to you, vice versa, So the more internal healing you do, yes. The external world is going to be the reflection.
And the way we teach that is if you have access to a source of bliss, then you have access to your own source of charge, and that's the end of you being a parasite. So essentially, if you're able to implode, which is what Phase Conjugate Mirror enables. Well, there's so much beautiful stuff there. We did invite Laura Eisenhower. Laura, are you there?
Yes, I just messaged that I have to run to another appointment and that I'd love to interview both Johan and Jodi. But yes, I'm still here, but I got to go in a couple minutes. But
just to say that maybe when we're concerned that Eisenhower got sucked into a treaty, not only did they lie about losing to the Nazis, but then they invited the Draco in. It was really sort of a turning point in a major series of messes. But now we understand a lot more about the dynamics of how that happened. But instantly, when Laura was interviewing with Elena Denon and learned Valiant Thor sent by Palladian Federation to try to actually show Eisenhower a better path. And Eisenhower tried really hard, and that's where you come to the MJ-12 story and that whole mess that ensued. So there's a whole nother piece of that story, which we'll have to do another time, I guess.
Oh yeah. She did mention MJ-12 doing this behind.
That's right.
Back, but there must've been some knowledge to a certain degree. So this is where I get kind of stuck, and I'd love to talk further about this. And yeah, we absolutely, of course, didn't win the war, and our history books tell us otherwise. That's why nobody is noticing the Mockingbird media and the paperclip scientists that are pushing what we're dealing with right now, right?
Right.
Exactly. Well, but thank you for being here. So that is a conversation then to be continued between Johan, Jodi, and you anytime. But
yeah. Laura, I'd love that. And of course, I have a really unique kind of insight to the whole Mockingbird thing since I was in broadcast media for so long.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh. Well, I'll have Dan help to connect us as far, I think actually you're in the email and I can just message you directly. If not, I'll let Dan know and he can help connect us, and I'll set a date and time and see if you guys are free, and I'll work around your schedule too. And it's been amazing to hear you, and thanks for having me, you guys, and everybody else. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Blessings. Thank you, Laura.
Okay.
So the Eisenhower karma will be healed. This is family constellation therapy on a planetary level.
Oh my gosh. Thanks again, Dan, for reaching out to me too. And I look forward to seeing you very soon in our conference. And I'd
Thank
love to
you.
do an interview with you as well. Okay. Take care,
Super.
everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye, Laura.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it was such a horrible turning point in history. You know, within a couple of years, not only did they lie about losing to the Nazis, and it's all because they didn't know how a vortex makes gravity, the Hanabu. So in fact, the principle of what allows a vortex to implode phase conjugate, which is how the phase conjugate mirror worked, how the black goo worked. If the physics principle behind all these things were understood, we would not have been sucked into that black hole, actually. And that's really what I'm about right now, is teaching the physics of that. That not only is the phase conjugate mirror the turning point, but also the same implosive capacitance, which is the brainwave frequency of bliss, which is tomorrow's video subject, actually is the turning point. Because fundamentally, parasitism is not possible if you have your own source of charge, and that is the implosion within, which we call bliss, which enables charge radiance, which, you know, we spent a lifetime teaching that. So but Johan, you guys know the politics so much better, like knowing about that fleet outside the Oort cloud. Now that's a juicy piece of gossip.
Yeah, I still get a lot of info from guys up there. So when they're passing info to me, it's like, usually I don't know what to do with it, because again, we took a hiatus from doing videos for a while, and it was kind of funny because it's like this piece of information comes to me, and like, hey, what the hell do I do with this?
Well, let's enable the conversation. And I have some comments on what you said too, but I want to enable other people in this conversation to ask questions too, if they would like. Marina or Taya or any of our friends here, if you had a burning question, please, feel free. I noticed that Geraldine Orozco is with us. Geraldine, you're wonderful. Thank you for being here. Feel free to say hi. Anybody, please.
What are your thoughts on what's going to happen next? As far as, now that we're free of the Draco contract?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways that this could go. Depends, since we've seen the change in what we would call the aggregate collective mind of Gaia Earth, right? PTI, Peter the Insider, he uses a different phrase, but I'm going to say just a collective unconscious mind of Earth. This became way more positive since the beginning of COVID. I believe that was an unintended side effect of the disease, because what we see is many people trying to help each other with the way that this basically collapsed, or at least our economy, at least here in the US and in Europe. We saw many people who were out of work. They needed food, they needed medical care, they needed all this stuff that essentially we look at as the basic needs on the planet. And people kind of bonded together, they came together, and it shifted their mindset a little bit to say, you know what, maybe I need to do something kind for somebody else because I just lost someone too, right? And we see this happening over and over and over again with this particular disease, where people are trying to focus more on this positive aspect of humanity. Now, that being said, if we stay focused on that positive aspect, what I would assume would happen is partly what I saw in the timeline where Johan was up there. What that means is we're going to see a couple of things happen. They've been trying to stave off a civil war here in the US for a long time, right? The next civil war. But what I would see happen is if they want to bring about disclosure, the first thing that's going to happen is we'll see medical technology from up there being brought down here. We already see some of this happening with groups like Foxconn and some of these other companies. There's a company we found, actually, Jodi and I did some research on in Phoenix, Arizona. They're using what's called a proton beam bed, which is essentially is a 0.1 med bed that actively seeks out the signature of cancer in the body. It actually targets that cancer and destroys it based solely on that signature. And they're trying to use it with other types of cancer and other diseases now. So this essentially is like a 0.1 version of an actual med bed. We're seeing that now in use. It's actively being used in Phoenix for a lot of different diseases and things. It is expensive. But when people ask me, well, do they have one of these? The answer is yes, it's in Phoenix, Arizona.
There's a very fascinating parallel that, you know, phase conjugate time reversal, which is age reversal by definition, is the core concept behind our plasma therapy.net, and which, by the way, we also have one in Phoenix. And at a low energy density, in fact, it is time reversal. It is neg entropy. And there is a literal sense in which a phase conjugate field will self-seek that which is resonance embeddable. That's what the paper Alice and Barium Titanate Land about phase conjugate dielectrics is about, that it is self-aware and seeks itself. So in that sense, it is self-organizing. And again, but there's a good side and a bad side, because the black goo has all that description as well. But the intent behind it is what enables. But so that, in my view, the science of medbeds, in essence, is to discover much more deeply the physics of time reversal as it has been measured in phase conjugate optics, and is now, in fact, in function in 25 countries of phase conjugate plasma with therapy.net. So we're deep into that, yes, as we are into carbon nano.
And the second step that I would see to answer your question, Angel. So again, first step is medical. I would see that as being the first big step coming out. The second step is actual transportation and energy usage here on the planet. I believe that at some point, probably for the next 5 years, they're going to come out and basically, if they release the technology I've heard them talking about releasing, what you're going to see is you're going to see some of these, like, well, for example, petroleum will become non-usable here as a fuel source over the next 10 years. But for the next 5 years, you're going to see them shifting the entire automobile industry over to electrics. You're going to see them shifting it over to other types of fuel sources, meaning stuff that we can easily replenish and doesn't destroy the atmosphere. And you're going to see them also, again, using like these plasmatics that are based on microwave igniters and that sort of thing. The third thing will be, how do we protect ourselves and our planet? At that stage, you might see, and again, this is where I see that the two lines kind of separating, diverging. One line says we go to a completely singular planet governmental body. The other idea is that we retain sovereignty, but yet we have an oversight body that decides, made up of all these countries, like the UN, that says we're going to go ahead and take over the super board, and the super board will effectively answer to us, and we will, in fact, at that point, start running colonies off planet, and we'll bring all that information out to the mainstay public. The problem with this theorem is that, and this is what I've talked about in some of my other interviews, is that you see many of these corporations right now, they're trying to move any of their more negatively aligned processes out of the solar system. This is why all the slavery stuff was moved off of Mars to 70 Virgis B. This is why all the cloning facilities were moved off of Mars to 70 Virgis B. This is why you see all these processes being moved out of the system. For example, our main prison right now for the people who are either ETs or in the SSPs is on Maki. People don't want to talk about that stuff because all of those individuals are on ice, meaning they're frozen. They don't want them rehoming back to their original bodies, because if they do, they'll have that intel, that knowledge, right? So again, there's a whole slurry of things that's going to come up. How do we tell human beings on this planet that you have 25 clones of you running around upstairs in space? And how do you determine who is who's the real you?
Yeah.
And how do you can't, with a fingerprint, a standardized fingerprint, you can't determine who that person is unless you use a microscanning microscope to actually read the number off the very center of your thumbprint, if you have one. That's how you find a clone. So trying to identify clones down here right now is next to impossible, because we just don't have the technology in place to do that. But that's a conversation, again, that we would have to have. How do you tell somebody, oh, by the way, you're not even in your actual original body anymore, you're in a clone body, because you got so fucked up there that we had to put you in this other body because we had to recover you so that your timeline didn't get screwed up.
Yeah.
And there's some part of that process which is fractionating to soul force. And the whole point of fusing the soul force is actually how we reconstitute our racial memory. Literally pull yourself together. Hey, I wanted to mention one little piece about the self-empowerment there, that if you look at what's called the EM drive, which is electromotive drive, which has very low propulsion, but they don't realize that the caduceus-shaped cascade of microwave in the EM drive could be optimized if they use my equation for phase conjugation. If you happen to know why an object falls to the ground, then you can actually optimize because you know the physics of phase conjugate implosion and how gravity is made. And that is behind the internal metabolism of all ultimate propulsion and energy devices, that the fundamental physics of how you cohere the vacuum and make propulsion is then behind the actual empowerment of the species, which, by the way, happens inside humans when they have access to bliss. So you see why we're so deeply involved in teaching the physics of phase conjugate implosion, how to cohere the vacuum, because that's the solution both inside and outside.
Interesting. That's fascinating.
If I may, Will, about that, something came on my radar last night and it just slammed through my head, and it was rather disturbing to me. Since we're talking about clones and all that, I was wondering if this stab was about maybe making other vessels available to other species such as Draco. And now that I find out that this contract has just ended, or the treaty has just ended, I wonder if that has anything to do with it. If it's a way to like infiltrate, us as a species under the radar, so to speak.
Well, it's funny that you actually mentioned that, because one of the things that Elena talks about in her book, and I've mentioned in a couple of interviews, both with Ted and I think with James actually, when he and I were still doing interviews, that the Draco used this statement called soul scalping, right?
Yeah, Elena talks about.
In her book, she even talks about that, where essentially what they do is they will take a sleeve, what we call a sleeve or a clone, remove the soul that's in it, and then insert their own into it. Now, the other methodology, we knew there was in fact a mission that I did where we knew for a fact that our database, meaning the SSP human database, had been somehow copied, and the Draco were trying to get it. And that database was in fact recovered and destroyed. That way they couldn't use it. Had they gotten a hold of that database, they would have had a DNA database of every person in the programs. And that would have
Not good.
that would have been directly toward your question, because they would have had the ability to make all these sleeves and clones without the need for the originating party to be involved.
When we talked with Rupert Murdoch's girlfriend at the time, who said she was able to prove that he'd been soul snatched, she slipped some LSD in her tea and was able to see the vertical slit eyeballs. It was quite a story. But then, the Secretary of the Navy there had a similar story. The point was, we believed that soul snatching was more likely if the person had holes in their aura, bad astral hygiene, or depression. Whereas if you had a very coherent aura, there was less likelihood of that.
Yeah. Also, getting back to Angel Song's initial question, as far as what's going to happen, I also channeled that around 2025 to 2032, we're going to have even more disclosure. And also, as far as on a micro level, for us individually, we may want to kind of get into some medical knowledge ourselves, because, with this COVID, it's not going away. There's other mutations coming. And a lot of the hospitals here in the US anyway, if you don't have the vaccine, a lot of the medical providers are of the stance, okay, well, we're not going to even treat you. So, it's the free agency is being taken away.
Well,
and so I would just say, have that medical knowledge for yourself and for your family and friends. If for whatever reason, the hospitals were to shut down, if some catastrophic event were to happen, and we're hoping that timeline doesn't happen, and you need to help your family. Also, Taya also touched upon this before. I also am of the belief we need to have some type of food supply and just be prepared. I've also seen where, people are leaving their homes and going somewhere where they have some type of land. If they don't have land, their lawns are being used for gardens so they can have some type of food supply. And then training, not just spiritually, but physically. So if you need to run for whatever reason, you can have that stamina. So those are the types of micro things I'm seeing that you need to pay attention to.
I understand this too, right? What my wife is getting at with the medical side of this, we've heard arguments from many folks here in the US, especially here recently in the media, where essentially you have people in the media calling out the medical community, telling them to essentially renege on their Hippocratic oath.
Yes.
And this to me is a huge issue, because most nurses don't believe in that argument.
Yeah. And my mom is a nurse, and she
So is
literally went to the hospital to be treated for her pneumonia, and she was turned away.
Yeah.
That's pretty sad.
That's
So-
crazy.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is that you have the medical establishment now taking the stance. If you're not willing to quote unquote do what we ask, we're not willing to help you.
Mhm.
Again, removing the idea of free agency in terms of how you manage your own health, how you manage your own health choices, how you manage your own body, right? So,
And with the introduction of cards, that does away with HIPAA. I mean, that's such a HIPAA violation. It's ridiculous.
Yeah,
What do
the
you-
freedom.
Yeah. And we were
Freedom
even
of choice.
talking this morning, that say you lost, that card for whatever reason.
right.
Now they're saying, okay, it's optional to register on this app, so we know that you've been
So
vaccinated.
now you're in a national database.
Right. So now you're in this database.
Database.
So it's like, oh my goodness, there's so many layers to this.
I wanted to mention that we've been working with a great group out of India, Vedicinals.com, VEDI, Vedicinals.com, a self-empowering natural solution. It's amazing. Check it out. I wanted to ask Johan what he thought of Elena's accusation that the vaccine contained what the ETs would call tracker dust, may be related to the black goo.
Okay, so here's essentially my stance on that. In order to get what's called the FDA gold standard, material inside of that vaccine has to be below so many parts per billion, first off and foremost. Any contaminant material, right? So the question is there anything contaminant wise that would be of high enough value to actually create a reaction that you're talking about, Dan, or that maybe Elena was talking about? And my answer to that is right now, I'll have to have someone show it to me, prove it to me, because I don't see anything in the data showing that. They wouldn't have gotten the gold seal from the FDA had that been not the case. We're talking specifically on Pfizer in this case, by the way.
Actually, they
Understand-
didn't. It was a bait and switch with the names, Johan.
Well, the thing is that J&J is a different type of vaccine. The actual Moderna is also a different type of vaccine. They work in different ways, medically speaking. And more specifically, those particular two vaccines have not went through 11 clinical trial tests. And again, I'm not saying Pfizer's good. I'm not. What I am saying is that because they went through these clinical trial tests, the FDA said it does not have any levels of contaminants above so many parts per billion.
Okay, so this is where my hubby, who I love so much, and I have like contradicting opinions. Okay,
Right.
so we talked about this probably 4 months ago,
Yeah.
maybe. So because I believe the FDA and NIH and WHO are compromised, I believe that, especially with the FDA, certain things can get under the radar
Sure.
or be named something else and get into the things that, like the vaccines or our food or whatever else. And, they can name it something different. They can say, oh, it's under, this actually is the gold standard now, or this actually passes regulation, or we've tested it, we've done so many, test trials or whatever, it's good. I think that no, it's not. So I think it does have things that can track. And I think that also, like Johan has said, the
Understand.
stuff with China too is not too far away, that if people decided to get the vaccine and they wanted to do that at some point. And if they decided, okay, you know what? We have hit the threshold. We told you guys, as far as the administration, we told you guys to get the vaccine. Guess what? We've run out. Okay, well, guess what? We now have good relations with China. Biden has great relations with China. Oh, China's going to come to the rescue and give us some of their vaccinations. Well, it's going to, as far as I'm concerned, in my opinion, it's going to be contaminated with all a bunch of junk. And if people are desperate and they're thinking, oh, we need the vaccine now, I would not, over my dead body, get a vaccine from China then.
But here's something else too you have to keep in mind, right? So I agree with what you're saying in terms of the US federal government being compromised. I'm not arguing that point. What I'm saying is that if we look at just the raw data, right? If you were to go look at the actual studies, look at the raw compiled data, I'm not seeing anything in it that immediately points out there's something immediately negative. Now, the other side of this too, understand this, right? They don't need dust to track us.
That's true.
I have talked about this ad nauseum with Ted on Quantum Red Pill Cafe. They can track you by mental signature,
Yep.
meaning the frequency of your brain. That's the easiest way for them to track you. They don't need dust. They don't need chips, which is why I think most of that stuff is bunk.
Mm-hmm.
Because they already do it with assets now.
Yep.
So when they pull you out of body and they transfer you to go back up there like they're doing with me currently, they don't need to have a chip in me to do this. They can track me by the frequency of what's going on inside my brain. They know what my signature looks like. So,
And for those who might still have inserts in them who have gone through the programs,
sure.
there's even, those ways to
Right.
track.
The inserts can be another way to do this too, but what I'm saying is that they don't need the dust or a chip to do this.
True.
Well, that's,
Now, the technology behind that, by the way, essentially is they use a computer up at the LOC that has, again, a database of every asset, the alters known signatures for that asset. And if they need to trigger that asset or bring an alter up, that computer has the ability to be accessed, and then they can force that alter to actually come up wherever they need it to come up. Abduction contracts being implemented within VAX. So that's a great question, Taya. So
We'll repeat it so everybody can hear it.
Taya asked the question. She said, what about abduction contracts being implemented within vaccines, right?
Well, and that's something that I do remember. That's why they are constantly coming up with updates, because these contracts are changing or there's new deals with new races. And so that's why they want to push it onto people, because they need to fulfill their orders.
Right.
Mm.
So again, I've said this in some of my videos. For a while, what we saw was abductions were starting to fall off as Earth and Space Alliance constricted space around Earth in our system. It made it really hard for ET species to get in here and actually do their abductions, that they're hunting basically, right? And what happened was we've essentially shifted all the cloning and the sleeve process out of the system. Many of these ET species have went to 70 Virtus B to acquire those particular contract requirements, but we still have groups that come here and hunt, and they're using new technology to do it. They've adapted their ships to do it. And what I would say is this, right? Many of these species do not have the immunizations against our flora fauna, meaning our bacteria and viri here. If they wanted to come hunt humans here, they can, but they may end up killing themselves in the process because of all the junk we've been injected with. So, I mean, they could do that, but I believe that's what we're going to see happen over time, is that because of what we're being immunized against and what we're being injected with, I don't know that that's necessarily something that they would want aboard their vessels in the craft. I do believe there are contracts. I do agree with you that there are abduction contracts. Those people come from certain genetic star lineages, or who come from certain genetic lineages, period, are hunted here. Absolutely. We know that ETs do live on the planet. We do know that they live here among us. Earth Alliance has a database of these individuals who are on planet because they have certain agreements with certain royalty. They come here and they stay here because they seek asylum here. But the idea is that we as a species, collectively speaking, we know that not only are they hunting lower animals than us and collecting stuff from them, for example, cattle mutilations, but they're also doing it to us too. We know this is happening. They're collecting our ova, our sperm, they're collecting DNA samples, organ samples. We know they're doing this stuff. So
doesn't the Andromedan Federation claim to be, keeping a lid on that?
Well, it depends on, so I want to say this. Again, this is a political statement, right? This gets back to what we were talking about, Dan, with politics, right? So this would be like someone saying, is the US sending troops over to another country, right? The US federal government comes out and puts a forceful statement in the news saying, oh, we're not doing that. But yet we have special forces on the ground who are actually operating in that particular area off of one of our ships, like SEALs or something, right? This is exactly the same sort of crap, right? So you've got the Andromedans who for all intents and purposes, they are a normally very positively aligned 5th, 6th density species. One of the things that they may not understand is that we view the idea of interloping very differently than the way they view interloping. And what I mean by that is, for example, they may say, well, if they're within the system, but they're not actually directly interfacing with humans, then they're not interloping. Whereas we say if they're in the system, they're interloping, right? It's about degrees of separation here, splitting hairs. And I believe that the Andromedans specifically and the Serens don't understand, they have a lower sensitivity to this than we do. We have a very high sensitivity to this because we've had so many species come in and do this to us. We're done with that. This is why what happened during World War II with the Germans and with our secret space programs, that's why they were developed, because we knew that space was the next frontier. We also knew that if we didn't defend it, that people would come in and take it from us. So that's why we've done what we've done for years.
Okay, so Sean asked, what do you all think is the holdup to disclosure? I read it's a card they put forward when they want a distraction, when they feel like they are out of control or about to lose control. Great question. Thanks, Sean. So I think they use a lot of distractions. And I have heard of that Illuminati card game that they have out there to basically say,
Yeah.
We have to let the public know what's going on before we do what we do. So I know Anthony Zenders brought that up a lot.
My statement on it, Sean, is essentially this. I think it's conditioning. It starts off as conditioning. The first thing they do is they try to they throw a carrot out there to see what will the donkey actually move the cart forward if we throw a carrot in front of it, right? We'll keep throwing the carrot to see if the donkey will continue moving, right? The donkey being humans collectively, and the carrot being this idea of, do ETs, UFOs exist? Eventually the donkey gets the carrot. And that is what we saw happen with this idea that the US military essentially disclosed this idea of the Tic Tac videos and basically saying, we know for a fact these craft are not ours, they're not human, and they definitely have some other propulsion system. We know this. Our pilots have said this, we've tracked it, we've got it on video. We know these videos are real because we can track it back to the aircraft that made the video and the pilots who flew the aircraft. So that's the first thing. Secondly, if you're asking the question, is this an actual distraction? Anything can be a distraction if you do not want people knowing what you're actually doing in Washington, D.C., right? We have seen this time and time again with multiple governments on this planet where they don't want us as humans paying attention to what they do. So sure, they can use anything out there as a distraction in that regard. They can come out and say, well, we want,
I mean, there's stuff about, the wall with the borders that was going on. There's stuff about Afghanistan now going on. I mean, I actually think there are ET turf wars going on right now
here,
on our planet.
here.
And the MSM, the mainstream media are utilizing all these distractions. So we don't know what's going on.
And to be more to the point, I would also say this too, that if you look at, so the whole idea of Machiavellian politics, right? That's really what you're getting at, Sean, is this idea that when you look at The enemy of my enemy is my friend. And if we create distractions or not looking at me kind of mindset, that is exactly what we're dealing with some of these politicians. They're using this as a way to get the spotlight off of who their associations are, right? I've said this before in a few of my interviews. Hillary Clinton was compromised. I believe that Trump was compromised. And I believe that Biden is compromised. They're all fucking compromised. The more distractions we have takes our eyes off of how compromised they are.
And to get
Sorry, Dan.
No, just to get a flavor of how difficult disclosure is, it means literally the US government, not only do they have to admit that when they lied about losing to the Nazis then practically took over the solar system. And at the same swipe, they invited in the Draco parasites who massively abducted millions of people as a result. I mean, talk about a turning point to have to admit you screwed up.
Yeah, and Taya says it well, it's a leverage game.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, like, I don't mean it as like, oh, the main purpose is the distraction. It's like a lot of the elites see they don't want to do this, but they feel like they have to eventually. So they want to put it in an organization where they're going to put it forth, at least what I'm reading, as when they really need to. Like if I'm reading like 5 things would need to happen to where they see it as worthy to like present forward in full swing, like a majority amount of protests. The vax agenda gets exposed, the election corruption completely gets exposed, the legal system has an exposure, and a lot of the elite pedo networks get exposed. If that gets comes out, then they'll definitely put a card forth. And before that, if you want any chance of increasing disclosure, there would have to be a internal rebellion in the SSP, where the people have some type of alliance form and they reclaim a bunch of technology in a big rebellion, and some type of major like SSP, NSA type thing, hacking and corrupting the data of their ability to spy on every one of the closed networks. And then on a huge awakening that could probably, if at minimum, take about 10,000 awakening psionic users to amplify towards that intention. So, hoping enough people see that.
Well, and the thing is we're seeing the list that you just rattled off, Sean. We've already saw small echoes of this already happening here within the US within the last 4 to 5 years, maybe 6 years even. And what we're seeing is as these echoes happen, what was actually occurring is we're watching people watch people's reactions to that. Meaning they're actually watching the public response to what is going on. Dan's statement about what happens when the federal government comes out and says, oh, hey, by the way, the Germans did win World War II. They left the planet. They created colonies. They got bigger spaceships than ours. And oh, by the way, they work with these lizard people called Draco who actually enslaved us. Have a good day.
Yeah.
When they put that broadcast out,
Hello.
and people change their diapers, you're going to see a whole bunch of people essentially go, what did they just say?
Oh, shit.
Yeah. And at that point, you're going to see a bunch of protests. And at that point, the game is up for the Draco.
That's great. We have a couple raised hands here. Marina, I think, was first. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Dan. I wanted to talk about the real Germans because lately I have been connected to my past life in World War II scenario, which is in real society. I'm actually connected to the real demon, the real women who were mediums. And so that's why I'm a medium right now in this lifetime. Because I was connected to that and I was one of them. And actually, I'm also connected to an SS general. So I wanted to talk about it because it's really important in our history right now, because we talk about the negative Germans, the ones who were actually controlled the Draconian Empire and who created the Dark Fleet. But I also wanted to talk about the real Germans who actually left the Reich and who eventually connected to the inner Earth groups of the Earth, the advanced civilizations, and other positive extraterrestrial alliances. And they actually became like a group of resistance who are actually helping us. And I'm talking from experience because they are actually one of the people who are helping me alongside with other ETs, of course, in my own disclosure about my own secret space program experiences, sometimes they kind of like even force me to go into a regression in the astral, and they will explain to me, this is what they did to you, you know, they put you here, they program you with nasty ideology, and they will also tell me, you'll be in this event talking about disclosure, and months later I will be invited to an event, you know, for actual disclosure, you know. And so there was this man who, it was a German person, he or it was a real man, I don't know his nationality, but he actually abducted me. And I was in bed and I expected that it was like someone negative. But what he did, it was he used technology to actually repair a level of my aura. And I don't know what kind of technology is that, but it actually assisted me. So after that, he gave me like real energy in my Kundalini. He helped me like repair my astral bodies, and he showed me like a picture of a woman who was wearing the same brill pendant that I have, that I bought some days ago, kind of like showing me that we are connected because we have a life in common. And these people have been contacting me to bring me like information about real energy and real technology. And I think that they're working with us for eventually disclosing how this anti-gravity technology works. And I'm feeling super excited. I don't know what kind of information you specifically have about them, but I will surely love to listen about it because I think it's really interesting.
Well, yes, you know, we do
Fascinating. Wow.
believe that the Vril Maria Orsic story, for example, that eventually did not go with the bad Germans, really, and that's another story. Very good. Maybe
They did not. No. So the story that I heard was originally the way the Vril Damen stuff way before 1923, 24. They had boxes of stuff that Maria and her other four ladies had been channeling. They just didn't know what it was. And it wasn't until 1930, 31, they got into the actual full society, when they got in contact with some of these high up, like civil engineers, mechanical engineers, people who are part of this society, that they finally said, okay, well, what is this data, right? The breakthrough was a guy who was in, I believe it was in Munich. He basically said, he was an actual ancient language specialist. And essentially what he did is he said that, well, this is actually, it looks like polar coordinates. Is what she's channeling. So they took an engineer and this guy who was this linguistic specialist, essentially started drawing out this picture, and it started actually being a plotted map of how to build the first Hanabu craft. We're talking the engine components, we're talking the anti-gravity components, we're talking the guidance components, everything in detail. And they had reams and reams and reams and reams of documents of this stuff. What we see happen is within 2 years of that channeling event happen, we see the Nazi hierarchy put this as their top Wunderwaffen design. We see Albert Speer, we see many others stepping into place and essentially saying this is going to be the weapon that actually is the end-all weapon, even above nuclear weapons. This craft will be the weapon we use to completely, utterly destroy our enemies.
And that's
what ends up happening is that because of what happened with World War II, you see part of these craft get moved to Norway and they get moved down to base 211 in New Schwabenland, which is Antarctica, right?
Yeah.
They complete construction of some of the craft down in Antarctica. The rest get completed at what we now call the LOC, which is on the moon. And many of the German programs that were part of Project Omega, which is the final project, also got moved to what is now called the LOC as well. This includes Kruger Mercenary Corps. This includes many other programs that are part of what we now would call the SSPs. And essentially, there is a small group of Germans who stayed in Antarctica, primarily because they were trying to make sure that everything was wrapped up and pulled off planet, because they didn't want to actually get under the auspice of a criminal charge, liability charge, by the Nuremberg trials or by what will eventually become the Hague. So that's essentially the main story. Orsic and her group actually left our system with a small group of Germans on one craft. They went to Beltagese and never returned.
But I think the empowering moment is when you have the equation for translation of vorticity in a vortex, and you understand why you need a dopant to keep the iron powder soluble, which is what made the mercury red, which enabled the flux density. So you had both inertial translation vorticity and magnetic flux translation vorticity. And that implosion is what makes gravity. And we have the equations for that. Suddenly you're no longer disempowered, but it starts by knowing why an object falls to the ground. Again, that's why I think we can transcend that tragedy by teaching some self-empowering physics, which turns out to be exactly how a vortex inside your mind creates vision without eyeballs. It's literally an implosive plasma vortex. So the physics enables us to be empowered past the parasites, maybe.
The two main chemicals used in these propulsion systems was what we call red mercury, which is what you're alluding to.
Yeah. The
other chemical is cesium-525, which was used in the Glocka, the bell. So,
which was a radioactive component.
Yeah, which is a radioactive component, created plasma, also created an anti-gravity effect as well. Yeah.
I know that you have very little time left, and Geraldine Orozco has her hand up, I think, and we respect if you're there, Geraldine.
Oh yes, thank you. I think Tia was first though, if I may. Tia, is it okay if we take her question or no?
As you wish.
Kind of
Please, I
long.
think you were first. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. But my question's kind of long, I suppose. But
speak loud. We can barely hear you, Tia.
okay, I'm not sure what's going on with my mic, but
yeah.
Okay, so my question's a little long, and so I don't know if it's really appropriate for this meeting, but it's regarding the history and how my memories fit into what you know, and you know, I've recently had some memories what I think are Montauk, and that you know we were traded with the Germans, and I believe this particular German group may actually be from like a different timeline or a different universe, and but you know it gets pretty confusing. But I have a lot of memories of being with this particular group and them doing all sorts of genetic experiments, and I actually believe that this particular group remanufactured for themselves new bodies, and that's actually who the Draco is. That they did the soul scalping, that or whatever you call, where because that they actually tried using reptilian DNA and making themselves transforming themselves, but that their bodies actually ended up breaking. I remember them doing this to me, and the DNA modifications wouldn't stick. So then they figured out basically how to push their consciousness into new bodies, and I have all sorts of different memories related to this, where they were basically creating reptilian bodies, doing different things with the technology, the advanced technology they have, I believe, on Titan, but also, you know, being able to move their consciousnesses into these bodies and actually getting stuck in them and then having to evolve, and that the Draco are very old, from what I have remembered, you know, millions of years old, but that their original inception is actually here on Earth, which I know sounds kind of wild and crazy.
I've heard that.
But that they're actually, you know, you could say from a different timeline or essentially from the future, and they came back to basically create themselves. And so, you know, I know that's kind of wild and crazy and out there, but that's what I've put up together up to this point. So
my answer to part of your question is yes, they've done that. If you look at what we call the Lixodon, the light soldier experiments were ran by the Nazis, what we would now call in Kruger a level 3 super soldier. Initially, those experiments were ran exactly that way. They had to graft in other DNA into the sleeve that you're copied into to be able to handle that kind of psionic energy when it gets amplified and created. Because the normal human body in its current form with all of its genetic issues can't handle the wear and tear of that sort of energy being used constantly over and over again. This is also where Project Asgard comes into play, which Ted and I have talked about ad nauseum. If you want to go look at the Quantum Red Pill videos on Ted Alexander's channel, you can see us discuss that. And yes, I do believe Draco have gotten trapped here because of that process as well. I think Jodi, the next question, I believe.
Misuse of time travel in part, yes. So you guys have little time. Geraldine, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, really what I want to say is, you know, I love to hear this history and how all these different races have come to be historically. But the way I tend to look at it is more from a perspective that's kind of not compartmentalizing who we're talking about. And maybe it would help many understand these different historical evolutions of these different races by looking at it more as consciousness, whether it's parasitic or non-parasitic. This is how I tend to look at it. And so when we look at it from that perspective, what I think would help the general masses understand how to transcend these events that are occurring earthwise is that we are very much an energetic signature. And that energetic signature is produced by a holographic effect that is coming from our genetic code, the genetic code that is a hologram of the soul which is giving that information, informing what we are. And a lot of these events that are occurring, like we talked about earlier, a lot of these, very parasitic events to fragment the soul are what cause this hologram to little by little go deeper and deeper into what we're seeing, this matrix. And the idea is that as we reintegrate those fragments, the human does have the ability of kind of releasing itself from this the parasites, right?
That's
This
exactly
black
what the work is that we do.
That's exactly what
Yep,
our work is.
yep.
Yes.
Yeah, me too, exactly. So seeing it from the energetic perspective, the DNA is actually one of the most important things because that's actually it's the prima materia, of what we are and what's being utilized here.
It's part of why we call this, the article is called Fusion in the Blood.
Yeah, exactly. And Dan does such a beautiful job explaining the physics of that. And the energetic side of it would be coming into that bliss. But more importantly, you talked a little bit about the goo, the black goo, and I've dealt a lot with that myself. Both in my body and also being utilized to remote view with the draconians, some of these maneuvers that were being done in the early, our timeline in the 2000s and before that. But what was interesting about that is that the black goo is this intelligence that binds into the genetic code and functions like a neurological mask that kind of manipulates and mind controls the subject. Yeah. So there are also different kinds of black goo, not black, but different colors depending on the sector of the universe from which it came from. And I don't know if you come across that information.
There's also something that's blue, other colors, like you said, but that's sentient, but also regenerates.
Exactly. And that's the interesting thing about that I find very interesting when we talk about genetic hybridization and also cloning, because this is a technology that's being utilized for that. And the difference between the clones and the hybrids, the agreements that we're making in a state of hypnosis or unconscious states, we have to remember that we make these agreements in the astral plane and when we're out of the body unconsciously, because we're not practicing and training our body to become aware, lucid in those states. So one thing that we can focus on now, really important, is to train ourselves to master this physical body, the awareness from the hypnosis daily, and also in dream time and when we're leaving the body. So if you have anything to add on that, I would really love to hear that.
Those are great points. I also think that's one of the reasons for myself why I meditate and pray even before I go to sleep at night, because in that astral realm, I call it the wild, wild west. I mean, so much can happen, and if you are not trained for that realm as well, so much can happen that may not be positive if you're not trained in that area. So yes, absolutely. Protect yourself in that way and make sure that you are at the highest vibration, even when you're in the sleep realm.
Exactly. So. Yeah. And Dan does an incredible job with the physics aspect, talking about embodying the bliss, which is exactly our protection. That is our empowerment as the human. When we enter that state, our auric field becomes aware on multiple dimensional planes, because the clones and the hybrids are operating on different dimensional planes. And that's why, we need to understand that the layout of what we're dealing with here, it's not just the physical, we're dealing with other dimensions.
Yeah, and to your point, they have a different signature, energy signature.
Exactly.
And I think for me, my alignment with my divine creator, that signature spark. And I said this in the last, show that we were in, we all have that beautiful signature note, and we need to attune that, to the highest vibration, so that not just in this realm, but other realms, whether we're doing certain missions or whatever, we need to make sure that we're attuned to that.
And, we learned something when we found the plasma field, therify.net, which is literally a bliss field and uses the same frequencies of brainwaves of bliss, which is fusion in the blood, is a measurable lucid dreaming trigger. And the physics of lucid dreaming, which we now know as longitudinal coherence interferometry, literally a fractal field, enables you to become active in what you call the astral. So the coherence in longitudinal interferometry, which is lucid, which predicts whether you take memory through death and whether you can time travel efficiently as well.
Oh, that's interesting.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, you see that energetically as well. I mean, the vibrational frequency changes completely and then can move because the vibration is higher. It can move through these, these wormholes that are created that you're moving through.
It's a longitudinal array, literally a fractal
Yes.
field, and knowing where the nodes are, which is why remote healing happens better at the nodes. But I know that Will and they have to leave shortly, so I leave it to you guys if you wanted to say something in closing or final comments. Or
I know that Sean had a quick question right here. How do you guys heal memory wipes?
Well, part of that is going to be what we're working on going forward in the future. We're actually bringing on QHHT. We're actually in the process of currently doing that.
Mm-hmm.
We're also working with people in terms of trying to get some sort of, we're doing SIA sessions now, that information access, trying to get people information about who they are so they can start triggering their subconscious to allow the subconscious to bring forward its own information. And thirdly, we're also doing a lot of energetic healing sessions as well. Now, what I recommend is if you focus, especially when it comes to Reiki, Iraku, and some of these more well-known, well-defined modalities, you can in fact use those, Sean, to actually have people pop, what I call popping the cork on the subconscious. And the question is how do you manage the outflow of gas, quote unquote, the metaphor of the gas from a bottle once you've popped that cork? And this is where things can get a bit dicey if you're not aware of what you're dealing with. I know many people who are, I'll call them therapists or psychologists, psychoanalysts, who use hypnosis, and they may pop that cork and not realize. They may call the person crazy because they're sitting and rattling off stuff in German, and this person never spoke German, not realizing this person was completely involved in the program. So this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the subject where we have people who are specialists in dealing with the brain who don't understand what has been done to the client's brain. And this is what we have to kind of be very cognizant of. And I believe there are many modalities that can heal those memory wipes. But I also believe that there's a lot of different ways you can heal that, depending upon how it works for you. So.
And I would just like to add, the traditional modalities that I would recommend would be inner child work as well as EMDR, because when you layer that with some of the metaphysical as well, that can also have those other things resurface.
Hypnosis.
Yeah, help you resurface, because you wouldn't believe how it's interlaced with even program stuff. So that starts coming up and you're like, oh wait, family of origin stuff. I can't believe that at 3, that's what was really going on. Oh my goodness,
Right.
And then it just all starts kind of like making sense and becoming cohesive. And it's just like, oh wow, okay, I see how that all fits together. And you start connecting the dots.
Yeah.
And it looks like Angel Song has
yes.
something to say. Thank you so much,
for-
everyone.
Yeah, thank you for
It's
having
been
us.
amazing. And Dan, thank you so much.
You guys are wonderful. It's been great. I think Angel wanted to say something about the Montauk reunion. Was that right, Angel?
Yes, thank you. I also wanted to thank a few people like Douglas from Psionic Warriors and Laura from karmicpath.com to help me through all this stuff. They've been amazingly helpful in doing all that. I also wanted to mention that there's a new site called yourtube.net. It's spelled YORETUBE.net. It is a free place where we can go uncensored and post whatever videos or whatever kind of content you would like. And that is being done by the Patriot Brothers, who you can find on Facebook. He has a page there, and he's designing my website actually for the Montauk Reunion 2022, thankfully, because I got lost trying to do it myself. So if you would hit them up, that would be fantastic. I know everybody's looking for a site where nobody's censored and don't have to worry about the words that come out of your mouth, and this is just a great platform. But I did start a Facebook page called the Montauk Reunion 2022. It is about the experiencers who have survived, like us, who have survived Montauk. And next year is the 20-year window of the Philadelphia project, which means that there will be a portal opening up on a certain day. And I'm not disclosing what that day is, but I plan on making it a 5-day trip for everyone. Hopefully we can all stay in the same hotel. So if we have any problems that come up, we can, be with each other and help each other out. I've also got 2 people in place already who have volunteered to, in a counseling capacity, should we need someone like that along the way. So I look forward to announcing the website, but for now we have the Facebook page, and it is kind of hidden. If you don't type it in there right, you're not going to find us. And I'm trying to keep it to experiencers only, so that way we're safe and we have a safe space.
Well, thank you. We knew Al Bielek and Preston Nichols very well, and Duncan, and so there's a long story for so many of us here. So thank you for that service, and we look forward to discussing that physics also. Is there anything else that needs to be said before we go here? I know that Will and Jodi have to leave us, and I just want to thank everybody. This has been really fabulous. It's a nice family meeting. Thank you, thank you. So Will and Jodi, blessings, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
See you all.
Thank you.
See you all soon. I really enjoyed. It's been sweet. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. May everyone be blessed. Thank you.